What's up guys, let's talk about it. What are going to be the best weapon archetypes for every single class? And what I mean by this is not necessarily what's the best legendary power, what's the best unique, but specifically, are bows better or crossbows? Which one has the better stat? I've been asked this quite frequently. Are swords better? Are daggers better? Are staves better? Are axes better? Or swords? So it really comes down to not only what your build can actually do, but also what's called the implicit on the item. So for example, the daggers in general will usually have a faster attack speed, but they will do less damage. Now you'll have to factor in, what do you want in your build? Would you rather hit harder for like, a million plus damage, or hit faster for less damage, but you can actually build up other mechanics, like for example, the combo points would be able to build faster, but it's kind of dependent on your build. However, there is kind of a general rule with these things with the implicits, which is the main focus on this video, which is the weapon type. So to explain how this works, the best way is to look at the very first line. So with the crossbow, every single crossbow that you get in the game will always roll with vulnerable damage in one of the first lines on the text. Now, bows will always roll with damage to distance enemies. I was always telling you guys, crossbows are always going to be superior than bows. Bows will never be the best in slot unless you're talking about a Sky Hunter unique, but for the most part, that's not what people are wanting to understand. They just want to know, is bow better or crossbow, daggers or swords? So to sum this up, we have to actually look at what's called damage buckets. So the vulnerable damage is classified in a different area than damage to distance enemies. Even if both of these numbers are 40, you will almost always deal more damage with the vulnerable, even if it's the exact same roll on the exact same stats on any item. And the reason why that is, not even if we're factoring attack speed, by the way, because I know that would be a factor too, but not even counting attack speed, vulnerable damage most of the time will be superior. And it comes down to damage buckets. What does this really mean? I'm not going to explain everything in this video, but to sum it up, you have different separate multipliers, and you want to touch every specific multiplier. This applies to all classes, by the way. Vulnerable damage is in its own category versus damage to distance is in its own category. This one actually will be better for two different reasons. So first off, we have the mindset that vulnerable damage is more valuable because it has a separate multiplier, where the gray multiplier is considered the mega bucket. The mega bucket is what everything is thrown into. So in your paragon board, on your tree, a lot of things will play into this gray area. The gray area is very easy to hit, so a lot of the things will always apply over here. That's like your core skill damage to cold, poison, could be fire, damage while werebear, werewolf. All of these things will be in this category. We're getting the other ones is a little bit more difficult to hit. That's why your vulnerable damage will be a lot better. Now in this case, we also have the damage to distance enemies meeting a requirement. Sure, this one, of course, you have to hit a vulnerable enemy, but if you play the rogue class, you obviously can apply vulnerability very, very easy because you have more likely put exploit on one of your glyphs, or you have puncture that can apply vulnerability. You're going to have it most of the time. Whereas the damage distance enemies can teleport right onto you. They can jump on you. You could be frozen. They're going to walk up to you. They're going to be hitting you within melee range. So this one is better for two different reasons. Again, the damage buckets is the most important reason, but on top of that, this one's another conditional thing where you have to be hitting damage to distance enemies. Now, to understand what it looks like on an item, so here's an item over here where we have the very first 40% vulnerable damage. That is separate from the other vulnerable damage, which can roll on the item. The other one, the implicits in this game always roll with the maximum stats. Sometimes you'll have to put like 5 out of 5. Like if you take this item, for example, and when we were to upgrade it, which we can go to even higher. So if we go to this crossbow over here, if I put 5 out of 5, you will see the vulnerable damage will always roll with the highest stats, which is 60. So that's when you upgrade it, it will upgrade all of those numbers. So starting right off, now that we have that kind of idea and mindset that the implicits exist and kind of the reasons why you would choose weapons over other ones, there are certain breakpoints that you may want. Let's say a dagger for attack speed, for again a breakpoint, but this is getting way complex. We're talking about like the top 1%, and I wanted to make this video a little bit more easy for people to understand, so we won't talk about breakpoints in this video because that's a separate subject, because it works on every single skill and that gets way too complex. So let's just kind of keep it simple and go over every single thing on every class. So starting right off, I want to start off with the barbarian. So some classes, they do overlap, so it's good even if you're not playing barbarian just to understand understand this not only for you if you want to maybe play Barbarian in the future, or if you're doing PvP and you're playing against them, but on top of that, you'll be able to know what your teammates may roll. For example, sorceresses, a lot of times they want to do like damage chilled, freeze, and that really helps out because that's generally what the sorceresses do. They like to freeze things, right? So let's start off with the Barbarian and we'll kind of work our way down. So in the very first slot over here, we will always be forced to use a two-handed mace. So we have no choice on this. There's not like a best in slot. Again, the legendary don't matter. We're just looking for the implicits. They do the same thing though. There are other items, as far as we're aware of, most of the uniques right now roll normal, but this could be one exception in the future where like the implicit on a unique is different. But every two-handed mace will always have overpower damage. You can see all across the board. So we don't have a choice for Barbarian in the very first slot. Now the next slot, this is where the question gets asked, which one is better, right? Should I run a sword, axe, mace? Which one is the best? Now if you can benefit on overpower damage, most of the time I always say like, you know, crit is going to be the king. However, there are certain times where if you're playing a very niche build, you can actually use overpower, because overpower is difficult for some classes to scale versus other classes like the druid can get it a lot easier if you're playing maybe like a pulverized druid. But there is also another thing that I want to briefly go over, which is the damage to healthy enemies and the damage to injured enemies. What does that actually mean? So to sum it up, a healthy enemy is above 80% health and an injured enemy is below 35%. So some of these numbers can roll a lot higher than other ones. So like let's say your damage with core skills that it deals like 30% more, whereas the damage to healthy or injured could go way higher, maybe even almost double the stats, because they're conditional, so they have to have another condition met. Now, damage against healthy generally is an okay stat, where injured can be kind of mid. And the reason why I say kind of mid, it's not useless, right? Because you're going to be able to, you know, eventually get the enemy to go to lower HP, and then you'll get the benefit, right? But there are times where if you're good enough, you're just going to be one-shotting most of the trash mobs anyways. And so you would prefer to have more damage against healthy versus injured. That's my thoughts on like those two specific roles, but I had to explain them. Overall, I'd rather just have raw damage so it's up 100% of the time, but sometimes you got to make that decision. So what would be the best in slot for Barbarian? Most of the time, it's going to be the swords. The reason why, crit, well, in the earlier stages of the game, you can actually run either. It doesn't really matter because you won't have the crit strike damage because you have no crit strike chance, right? If I'm doing 1,000 crit strike damage, if my crit strike chance is only like, 5%, early on in the game because I don't have any items, then of course, that you will want maybe an axe or mace. But this video is mostly for like end game content, so we're talking like, world tier 4, all right? Because that's what people want to know. They want to know the best. So I would say in Barbarian's case, swords are going to be superior. It's again because of the implicit. Now, if you need a special modifier or you need to use an axe or any specific item, yes, these are conditional, but I'm not going to get into that. I'm just going over the raw, like which one's the best, and obviously, yeah, axe again. But the other one, the other two-handed weapon, what's better? Great sword, heavy axe, or the pole arms? So we have extra damage to injured enemies. Again, these numbers on two-handeds will be a lot higher. You can see there's only 35 crit strike damage, but the other one's like, well, we get 50% damage. Well, that actually is not so bad. I would prefer damage to healthy, so I actually think in this category, if you want to, an axe is really not that bad. But I usually prefer crit strike damage, even though it depends on your build. A lot of higher end builds will reach over 50%. So if you want to look at 50%, and if you have, let's say, 100 crit multi, it's almost like whatever the crit strike damage is basically the damage that you're dealing as a multiplier of half of it, if you want to think of it like that. Look at the damage buckets. This is in a separate category, so it's going to be, again, more valuable than, let's say, just damage to healthy enemies, because damage to healthy is in the big damage bucket, which usually is going to be so high that you would prefer to get other damage. But for the most part, sword is still going to be king in a lot of categories, the great sword for the two-handed. But again, I will give a shout out to axe, but most of the time, you don't really want to get this. The reason why is because you want to eliminate the enemy maybe in one hit versus hitting them 2 times, because you have that bonus damage up at the very start when the enemy is healthy. So again, choose what you want to on this one. Sword or axe are great. So moving on, again, I just wanted to go over the weapons because this is kind of like a very important video for most players, and this is a frequently asked question. So with druid, what's better, a two-handed? Now, there are certain circumstances where there are going to be different options that are totally fine. So if I was to create a druid, what would I want? So with staffs, this also applies to sorcerers, by the way. So some of these, again, that's why I was just saying watch the whole thing, because it'll make a little bit more sense, because I'll explain certain mechanics in the video. But damage to controlled enemies, I mean, you're going to usually have that up 100% times. I've already talked about axe. You can do damage to healthy enemies, not super bad. overpower, you can technically use it. We have overpower damage with a two-handed, and then we have a axe. So the only one over here, if you're not using any overpower, which some builds may not want overpower, which one is going to be up most of the time? Well, it depends on your build. I know there's the Storm Druid, that's a very popular one, where you're using like the Werewolf, or you can even play Pulverized Druid. It depends on your build, but there's nothing here that like stands out so much to the point where like you may just always want this. It's kind of up to you on your build. I've seen lots of different options. Crowd control is going to be up most of the time, so that one would be kind of a better one. If you are running a offhand, there is cooldown reduction, and sometimes it's much better to get cooldown reduction than getting more damage. Sometimes you do want that special legendary power on your two-handed, because the two-handed legendary power will then double in its stats. But if you're running a build where you need two legendary powers on two different weapons for the build to function, then of course, yeah, then run which one would I run? So staff is pretty solid overall, or you can even run axe. But in terms of the one-handed, would I run a axe or a mace over here? So damage to healthy versus overpowered. Can you even run overpowered? Overpowered is a mechanic. It's almost like another variant of crit, but it can be a little bit harder to scale, especially on other classes, but it doesn't really matter too much for Druid at the end of the day. So that's my thoughts with Druid in terms of the best. And like I said, it's kind of up to you on that one. Next up, in terms of Necromancer. So what is the best in here? So we have swords. I've already mentioned swords are very, very good. Life on kill is pretty much a worthless stat. And then we have a crit strike damage with the two-handed sword. I mean, it's basically the same as the regular sword, life on kill. And then we have the Grim Wand, which has lucky hit chance. Do you need lucky hit? Again, damage to close enemies is not very good because, of course, we have that giant damage bucket. I know I keep on referring to this, but it's very important to kind of stress like how it works in this game. But it's kind of like a worthless stat compared to getting the crit. Now, there's another mechanic here where this one is a little bit different. It also applies to sorcerers. Lucky hit chance could be really good if you need to activate certain things. And because you're running a one-handed, you can throw in an offhand for them. So we have cooldown reduction, or we can run a shield. Do you want more survivability? This one also technically gives you thorns. I haven't seen thorns be super popular, but if you need damage reduction, this is obviously better. But cooldown reduction is very important on every single class. Getting the ability to get 7% cooldown reduction is awesome. So if I was running a offhand, I would always run cooldown reduction versus survivability. But if you need that, or if you're playing a thorns build, then yeah, obviously go that route. But in terms of the one hand, what would I run? I think swords are excellent. I probably would just stick with sword because, again, life on kill, I mean, do you really need that? If you need it, by all means, sure, but there's better options for healing in the game, I think. Or you can run the lucky hit chance. So if you want more damage, obviously swords, and if you, like I said, do not run dagger. But sword for damage, and if you need the lucky hit chance, because there's a lot of things that like work on lucky hit, and if you want to increase that, then the wand would be better in the necromancer's case. Now, next up, rogue. Okay, so starting right off, we have bow, crossbow. Well, we already know from the little intro and what I explained, the crossbows will always be better. There's never any situation where a bow becomes better than a crossbow. It's no question on that one. All right, next up, what do we want in terms of the weapons here? So it comes down to swords or daggers. Daggers hit faster, but they do less damage, and they have damage to close enemies. I would much rather have swords. Again, comes to the damage bucket thing, so swords on the rogue for both of them, no question about that. And then we also have the sorcerer, and then we also want to cover at the very end of this video, I wanted to briefly cover like what are the best roles. I kind of made a video talking about this, which I'll link down below, that goes over the best roles, but I'm going to do a brief short summary because it also applies to the best weapons in your class. So starting off is in terms of the weapons, we have some options. So we have Archon Staff, so we have damage to controlled enemies. If you're playing any ice build, you're always going to chill the enemy, so you will also have this up 100% of the time. So if you want raw damage numbers, the staff is going to be better. But most people will prefer getting lucky hit chance because you get chance to gain resource. Most people are playing ice shards, right? That's like the meta build right now. So you would definitely want a wand for most builds. Even though you can hit harder, having lucky hit means more resource, so you don't have to sit there not doing damage. So it's going to be better most of the time. Plus, you get cooldown reduction. Getting lucky hit and cooldown reduction is just awesome. You can also get cooldown reduction in your amulet and your helmet. Sorcerers is a class where it takes a really long time to get the class up and running. Very similar to the druid, right? They feel a little bit weak. Well, sorcerers feels pretty strong in the very beginning, but then once you get to like world tier 4, it feels very weak because like you're just out of your cooldowns until you get all of these things met, so you can get more lucky hit chance to get resource, and then obviously cooldown reduction and lucky hit will be a huge benefit for your build. But going over what are like the best stats to roll on it. Now it depends on your build obviously, but most of the time it's going to be vulnerable damage, crit strike damage, core damage, and then this one we have damage to close enemies. So if you can upkeep it, like if you're playing a melee build, damage to close enemies can be good. If you're running a class that can run dexterity or strength, those are great. Intelligence is not like super bad for most builds, but right now resistances are in a very bad spot. Lots of content creators have already made videos. I made a video too, but in season 2 they just mentioned that they're getting buffed. So intelligence, and if you're watching this, it's not the worst. Season 2, when that comes out, intelligence will be getting buffed because it's bad, because it gives you all res. So I genuinely don't mind getting a dexterity or strength on the two-handed, but you can also actually shoot for all stats. This is one area where Barbarian becomes very good. On the Paragon board, this could be another 10% damage on 2 different like yellow nodes, because if you've played in the Paragon board, there are certain like things that you need to hit. So the stats are not that bad on it, but you can also get damage that you can keep up. Like for example, if you're playing an Ice Sorceress, right? I know this is a rogue, but you get the idea. Like all these stats, we would almost always be able to use, unless we're not doing a core skill and we're doing like Blizzard. There are certain exceptions, but for the most part, these are kind of the modifiers that you're looking for. But the main purpose of this video was to explain which one is better. Should you run like a dagger, or should you run a wand, and what should you actually play? Because sorceresses, they can actually use, I believe they can use daggers as well. It's weird, it's not like listed here, but it doesn't really matter. You don't want dagger anyways. You want the wands, but there can be times where maybe if you really want that crowd control, and if you're running a build that has no lucky hit chance required, no cooldown reduction, which I'm gonna be honest, there's no sorcerer's build I think that does not benefit off of cooldown reduction. That's like one of the most important stats to make the whole thing a lot more fun to play. But that wraps it up. That's going to be the video for the best weapons and every single class category in terms of like the item class, and we explained the implicit. So anyways, thanks for watching. If you guys enjoyed the video, drop a like on it. If you're new here and want to learn more about Diablo 4 to min-max, subscribe, turn the bell, and I'll see you on the next video. And also check the pinned comment for more content.